Hello, readers. Welcome to 20 Questions with Your Favorite Author, where we ask authors important questions like, why would you agree to be on this podcast? I'm Kelly Lynn Colby, Editorial Director at Curse Dragon Ship Publishing. Our guest this week is Steve Ruskin, writer of supernatural thrillers and Mountain Bike Guide. Steve's the author of the best-selling The Newton Cipher and other genre fiction novels. He is a historian of science with a PhD from the University of Notre Dame and authored America's First Great Eclipse, which became a top seller during the Great American Eclipse of 2017. He's not just being now, he will be out. Welcome, Steve. Welcome. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. It's good to see you, Kelly. Thanks for having me on today.
Yes, it is wonderful to see you. We have a good crowd pulling up. We've got Florida Kevin on, and John K. Patterson just logged on.
Hey, John.
We've got Maya and moms and all kinds of fun people. So welcome, everyone. Please, like always, if you want to put your questions in, we would love to have them. Steve wants to answer your questions, not mine. So put them in, and I will read them as they come up. But first, we have a traditional, very important question to ask at the very beginning. You ready for it to begin?
Hit me.
All right. Where do you get your ideas?
Where do I get my ideas? I know you always ask this, and I just, like some people know, some people, I think I'm one of those where my eyes or my ideas just kind of filter up subconsciously. I will admit I get a lot of ideas. You mentioned I'm an historian. I am an academic historian, and academic history can be so boring. And you read these great things and you're like, what if this happened? And I've always been like that ever since I was young. Because I love, I've read, like so many of us, I read science fiction and fantasy when I was a kid and went on to be, to work on my PhD. And well, that was fun and I enjoyed it very much. I know that there were definitely things that came up and I was like, wouldn't it be cool if, Newton's alchemy was, if alchemy was real and magical. So that's, a bit of what kind of inspired the Newton Cipher. So things like that. But, I guess I don't have a good answer. They come when you're walking around. They come when I'm working out. They come when I'm running. I do get good ideas when I'm working out, though, I think, because my brain tunes out. I mean, it's amazing the places your mind will go to when your body's in pain just to escape. And I get a lot of good ideas doing that, too. Kind of free your conscious mind, let your subconscious filter, just kind of wander around and pick things up. So
see, when I go exercise, my mind is obsessed with, you need to breathe now. Breathe, breathe, breathe. That's about as far as I get.
Yeah. So, but of course I get ideas from all the other great writers and readers that I hang out with too, like you guys and all of our friends who we, our network of writers that we have. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And that was a great answer, by the way.
Thanks.
So with your PhD in science history, how much does that area of expertise influence your work?
My fiction, you thinking?
Mm-hmm. Well, either. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. I suppose quite a bit. I've written a lot of some of my very first short stories when I started writing fiction were sort of based on history of science. And in particular, some of my first characters were naturalists, right? So my field was 19th century science. I did a lot of work on the history of astronomy, which actually included ideas of extraterrestrial life, because that was one of the specialties of my advisor.
Cool.
And he's actually on Ancient Aliens. Is that it? That show?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and not that he's a believer, but they got him on as an expert. And one of my buddies from Notre Dame is on there too. So we did a lot of history of astronomy, and that included, because everyone was speculating about, in the 19th century and then before, really for centuries, mm-hmm. Astronomers speculated on life on other planets. So there was kind of that piece. Yeah, still do. Mm-hmm. But I also did a lot of work with naturalists, right? Explorers, people who were, botanists, zoologists, as we would call them now. And so some of my very first stories were actually about naturalists. I did one character that I've reused a few times, most recently in an anthology called Superstitions that Jace Killen put together, of a naturalist who explored kind of a weird West, right? He kept encountering, spirits and things like that. I also would write about, I wrote a great short story, well, I liked it when I was younger, about the canals of Mars, right, which we know didn't exist, but in this story they were real, and the Martians came to Earth had a few choice words for some of the astronomers who were spying on them, they thought. So things like that. So basically, in my early career, when I first started writing short stories, and maybe that goes back to your first question, I did actually kind of draw on the sorts of things that I was working on to come up with some of my fiction ideas. And I think they just sort of came up naturally, So, but lately more of my, I've been writing science fiction, and in the book, The Newton Cipher, I drew on the history of science that I knew for the Newton Cipher, but that didn't really come from my historical work. My knowledge of Newton kind of helped inform the plot. But that didn't necessarily come out of any work that I had done as a historian. And then I write a science fiction series and other stuff that is strictly future sci-fi space opera. So I don't really draw too much on my history.
Has to be for fun. Maya wants assurances that your advisor isn't the hair guy on Ancient Aliens.
He's not the hair guy. No. My advisor wrote this massive book called Ideas of Extraterrestrial Life, and it covers almost a millennium. It's a classic work, actually, in the history of science. He's a great, very intelligent guy. But he told me once that we get calls from like the National Enquirer, right, saying, we know you're kind of an expert on extraterrestrials, and he'd be like, not extraterrestrials, but what people thought extraterrestrials might be in the past, and then please just tell us you've seen them. And he'd be like, no, I can't tell you I've seen them. He'd get these crazy calls from all kinds of places, or requests to like weigh in on actual extraterrestrials, and he's like, we don't know. All I'm telling you is what people in the past thought of what they might be like if they existed at all. That kind of thing.
You're like, I'm doing science here, people.
The stories were hilarious. So it was great. But that wasn't his only focus. That was just one of his many projects over his long career. So anyway, his name is Mike Crow, by the way. So if you do watch Ancient Aliens, he pops up a bit in some of the later seasons, I think. So
that's pretty cool. Well, that's why I enjoy that show, because the history they do teach in that show, because they talk about history and then they go with their crazy theories, but then you still get that history part, and I like that.
Right.
Let's see. It's obvious you used what you were talking about in the Newton Cipher. So exploring the actions of Isaac Newton embroiled with magic, which was so fascinating. I have to say, at the very beginning, when you feature Newton, because he's not in it, right? It takes place in modern times, but he's in the beginning. And so he talks like in the language of alchemy. And he says, like, in autumn bathe the doves of Diana in aqua fortis. Let the white swan swallow the black crow. The emperor shall burn with the eagles of Hermes. Is this like real? Like, did they actually use this in alchemy, or did you make that up?
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, I made up some of it but alchemists. I did the beginning. Newton was isolated in Cambridge. So this takes place in 1666, 67. So let me start. There's a few pieces here. So that first bit, Newton, it does the Newton Cipher and the subsequent book, which I'm kind of in the middle of editing right now. And it's kind of continues that Newton's not in it so much, but it continues the alchemical magic piece. It's a supernatural thriller, right? So I always loved Clive Cussler, right? And, he always would start with some history bit and how that affected the modern world. And that's a pretty standard structure.
That's how I found out about Library of Alexandria. That was Clive Cussler taught me.
Exactly, right? That was and that was the one where they ended up going to Texas, right? Because they hit it off Texas. But yeah, Cussler. So it's basically that's when I start with Newton. Some things that happened back then affect the present, but I do kind of dip back as the story goes along. I like to kind of drop back just to kind of give little clues to the plot that's going on in present day, right? So that stuff I tried to make as accurate as possible. Newton was isolated in Cambridge during the plague, and I made sure that the dates in my book lined up as nearly as possible. I think it needed to tweak a few things for my own plot, but I really try to make the history pretty accurate. And Newton's such a great character. I mean, he was crazy smart. We know that. He was pretty odd in a lot of ways. I think he had a lot of self-confidence issues early on. There just were a lot of things about him, but he was totally living in his head, and no one could really keep up with him. So he's a fun character to write, and his insecurities I kind of use as a key plot element in my book, kind of, especially once you get to the end. But I won't reveal too much of that because it's giving away my own plot.
But So the alchemy stuff. So that was real. They actually used that kind of language.
Yeah. So alchemists were very, very secretive of their processes, because what they were really talking about, it wasn't just turning lead into gold. It was the whole idea that in God's creation, because alchemists, I think, were very spiritual people, and specifically Christian, type of, for the most part. And they saw alchemy as a way of understanding God's creation by seeing, God created this whole world, and there's this great chain of being from the angels on down to the snails, right? With us kind of closer to the snails. But the idea was that, matter could be transformed if you knew God's secrets. But it was because these were secrets and required lots of work and were potentially dangerous, they coded it in this sort of language. So things like the rooster crowing at dawn, or the lion devouring the sun could mean something like melting mercury, or burning antimony or something to get a new product, which wouldn't be antimony ash. It would be the scales of the snake or something like that. So you would know, if you were an alchemist, what these other alchemists were talking about in their recipes. But if you were just us, right, you'd be like, what? This is cuckoo, crazy talk. So
it sounds like magic to me, right? So I can see where that all came from. It's so fun. Fascinating.
Because it's a quick step, just to the side to turn it into sort of magical spells and potions and stuff.
That's so cool. I need a book of those. That sounds fascinating to me.
There are books out there. I have them on my desk. I don't have them nearby, but they're out there. Yes.
That is so cool. Florida Kevin says, isolated during the plague. We can relate.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I wrote the Newton Cipher. It came out last summer, but I finished writing it just before, and turned it into Ring of Fire Press, Eric Flint, 2 months before we went on lockdown. So it was, and it's basically about a big plague. So anyway.
It's incredible. Sometimes fiction. Let's see. So we talked about that the bulk of this novel takes place in modern times, but draws heavily from historical events. With, let's say embellished elements, which we talked about with the magic. Did you get to travel to London to research the locales featured?
Yeah, actually, I love to travel. That's one of the things that's killing me most about kind of this current situation. My mom is German. I love Europe. I've traveled all over the world, Austria, a little bit in Asia. My wife's been to Japan. I'm jealous of that. Australia, I said, but mostly my time's been Europe. My mom's German. Right after high school, I went and backpacked around Europe, stayed with some of my family, and then I loved it. I was just growing up in Colorado, where it's obviously beautiful, but everything's new. I mean, the oldest structures, Colorado Springs itself has just turned 150 years old, and so going to a place, especially that I knew my mom was from, where you're walking on streets and walking through buildings that are millennia old or more. I was just blown away. And that's kind of what inspired me to become a historian, because then I went back to college and I was like, engineering, political science. I was 18 too. I mean, I admit I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I said, I'm going to be an historian. My parents like, you're going to do what now? But then I got into Notre Dame, and, that was kind of a PhD. Fortunately, they didn't have to pay. And then they were like, that's great. You're going to a great school. And I was really happy. So I always, most summers I was spending some time in Europe. I even became an exchange student for a little bit. That family that I was with in Germany, I'm still very close to. I went to Cambridge. I was during my PhD, or for my PhD, I lived in Cambridge for a while. I had a grant to go. That was great. So I was, walking the same streets Newton was walking. You could see his rooms at Trinity College everywhere you walk by. So that features prominently in the book. I went down to London all the time. And then that picture I even have, that we used for the advertising for this, that was me in Greece, just November of 19, just again, a couple months before things locked down. So I love to travel, and it absolutely informs my writing. Even my sci-fi, I sort of mention parts of Europe and stuff. And the next book for the Newton Cipher, the follow-on, will take place in Paris. So.
Ooh, fun. That sounds like a good excuse. I mean, you have to go visit again.
Yeah, I haven't been to Paris in ages, but I still remember it pretty well. So, and Google, right? Google Maps, Google Earth, you log in, you're walking the streets. It's cheating. It's not as fun because you don't get coffee and the smell of fresh baking bread and croissants and stuff. But for research purposes, it'll do.
Well, I think if you've already been there, right? Then you have kind of an idea. So just using Google to fill in the details, I don't think that's cheating. I think that's smart writing.
It's cheaper.
It is cheaper also. Not as much fun.
It's not as much fun.
Let's see, since we've been talking about scientists a lot, and my degree's in biology. I have a BS in biology, and I adore scientists. I find them just as fascinating as the science sometimes. So if you could go back in time and meet a scientist, who would you pick?
It'd probably be a guy named John Herschel, right? He's the guy I did my PhD on. He was the most, his father, William Herschel, right, was the discoverer of the planet Uranus, right, from Bath, England in 1781. He had one son, this guy, John Herschel. Everyone looked up to John. John turned out to not just be the son of a great astronomer, he turned out to be sort of a genius in his own right. They kind of saw him as sort of the next great British scientist, kind of in Newton's line, right? So if you go to Westminster Abbey in London, you see the great, have you been there?
I have not. London's on my list. I have been to Germany, but I've not been to London. Yeah.
Cool. And that's fine, but there's this great tomb of Isaac Newton's right there. It's an elaborate altar piece. It's just beautiful. Well, right down below Newton, there's two people buried at his feet, or at his grave, whatever. One is Darwin, and the other one is this guy, John Herschel, right? And everyone knows Darwin. No one knows who this Herschel guy is. And his name's written in Latin anyway, so that makes it even weirder kind of for us. And, no one really, reads Latin anymore anyway. Right. But Herschel, Darwin looked up to Herschel in his own day. Herschel was the original crazy white-haired guy. You think of Einstein, but Herschel had crazy hair long before then. And he did work in astronomy, botany, photography. I mean, he really was. He was at the center of science. Darwin, when he was on the Beagle, John Herschel was at the Cape in the 1830s. That's what I did my dissertation on, John Herschel down at the Cape. And Darwin, the Beagle stopped, and the first thing Darwin did was go to visit John Herschel because he looked up to him. So this guy was really, no one knows him now, like I said, but he was kind of he was it in the 19th century. And so that's who I would go back and visit. I don't know what I would say. He was apparently very socially awkward. Like Darwin has this great quote when he went to meet John Herschel. He said, it's a great quote. He said, John Herschel walks into the room as if he knows his hands are dirty, and he knows that his wife knows that his hands are dirty. In other words, he's this really he was always very quiet and stuff and shy and awkward. So he was, he was kind of a funky guy in that regard. But that's probably who I'd go back and meet. Mostly because I've read all his letters, and he'd be like, what's up with that, you weirdo stalker?
Yeah, maybe don't tell him that when you first meet him. Well, you don't only write alternative history thrillers. We talked a little bit already about your space opera that you do, the Exo Rock. Is that how you say it? Yes,
that's what it is, and that's the name of a company. And it's great. I mean, that was one of the first. So the novella, which I give away free on my website, is called "Deal with the Devil's Broker." I'm pointing over to my other monitor here, where I'm kind of watching the feed on Twitch, but I know it's cycling through. So the Deal with the Devil's Broker, I'll give you my website at the end. Well, it's steveruskin.com, but we'll talk about it at the end again. But you can download that for free. And it was a novella I wrote years ago, actually when I was first learning to write, with Dean Wesley Smith. It came out of one of his writing prompts, and wrote it. And then I liked the characters. And so I wrote the next one, which is called Prometheus Outbound. And then I wrote the one after that, which came out last year, Asgard Reborn. And I have the third one. I'm just waiting to do it because I've kind of got another project that I'm working on, which we can talk about if you want. But I really like space opera. And this character is just sort of she was a low-level mech driver, right? Think of mechs think of Ripley and Aliens. The mechs are somewhere between that, yellow thing she was driving around to fight off the Queen, and maybe a little bit more on the spectrum toward, somewhere between those and the cool kind of mechs they use in Avatar, right? When they're the kind of the mean military bad guys. The mechs that I'm picturing they're cargo mechs basically. And anyway, things go south. The world I create has these sort of council princes, which are basically ruling families in this empire. They're all on this. My books take place in this periphery of the empire, which becomes very important. There's a bigger empire which doesn't really feature. They're just kind of in a backwater. And there's these little squabbling princes that own kind of all the resources. And anyway, she's got to become a rebel, and she has this team of mech pilots, and they don't really get weapons because the princes don't let them have them. So they start using their mechs to fight back. And it's been fun to write. So I'm looking forward to the third book, which I have plotted out. I just need to to get it written. But I've always enjoyed space opera. I mean, who among us hasn't, right? From Asimov and Clark onto the more recent stuff. I mean, I'm in love with The Expanse and stuff. So yeah, so it's just kind of my little contribution to the genre. So
That's awesome. Well, Dave says he loved Devil's Broker, so obviously you're rocking it.
thank you, Dave.
Let's see. So you talked about the mechs. I think I love, because at the beginning of this, in Prometheus Outbound, you have let's see, a mech salesman putting it on thick for your protagonist.
Right.
It's Noemi, right? Noemi?
Yes.
As he shows her around his newest line of mechs, right? So he's really laying it on thick. Yeah. And this scene felt so real to me. So I was wondering if you'd had personal experience with this kind of trade show.
It's funny you should ask. Actually, I haven't. Granted, I don't talk to a lot of people about this, but you're exactly right. So I worked, after grad school, after my PhD, there just weren't a lot of jobs in academia, and those jobs that do exist, there's 200 people fighting for them, and then you get $30,000 a year, plus, your department responsibility. I mean, my wife as a teacher was making more back then. So I went into the corporate world, and I worked in marketing and sort of some support side, but I worked closely with the salesman because I knew the product. And yeah, so all this comes from all the salesmen I watched, and they were great. I mean, I'm obviously stereotyping, caricaturing them.
It felt real.
Salesmen can be real weasels. I was actually thinking of our competition, not the salesmen I worked with. They were pretty cool guys and girls. So, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I was wondering because it felt like personal experience. So it was. I get it now.
Yeah, I wanted to work in that cringe factor. But we get that every day. I mean, how many sales calls or like phone calls do we get? Or you go to, even when you buy a car or something. My wife just had to buy a new used car, and it was fine. It was at CarMax. They're not quite as pushy, but you come in prepared, you're all ready to fight, or to resist. You're ready to say no, and that's kind of what I wanted to convey. Even though Noemi, sorry. See, now I've got my daughter's friend's name, Naomi, but Noemi does, she needs these mechs. She needs them bad, but she doesn't want to let on that she needs them bad. But she knows she needs, so she's there to negotiate.
Yeah, she can't be an easy mark. Come on now. So we talked a little bit about the history, and we talked a little bit with the thriller, and then we have the space opera, and they're so different. What can you tell us about the difference in the world building between the two styles?
That's a good question. Space opera for me is a little bit more, I find it a little bit easier to write, probably because I'm making it up. I'm really making it up. I have no constraints. I've never been to space. I've just seen lots of space movies like all of us, right? But we've never been to space. I've never fought, in the middle of a cargo bay on a space freighter, in an asteroid belt or something. But I've seen enough movies and can wing it enough to sort of make it kind of whatever I want. So this is for me, of course. For the history, for the supernatural thriller with the history piece, that really slows me down because I am an academic historian. I have this, I'm not proud of it, but I have a real block when it comes to writing history because I'm worried that I won't get things right. Now in fiction, you shouldn't worry. I mean, you should get enough right, I think. I think too many facts can bog you down. The problem is I spent so long training as an academic historian where every sentence has a reference or a citation, and you're worried about the other 3 people in your field that are going to read this and might criticize it because tenure's on the line or something. And so that it sort of instills an unconscious fear in you. And that's something that I've always struggled with to sort of wean off of, because I wrote a lot. They say you need to write 1 million words of whatever so you're good. And I'm, give or take, whatever. It's rule of thumb. And it may not even be valid, but it's probably a good mark. The more you write, the better you get. The more you do anything, the better you get.
Right.
So I wrote tons.
It's a skill, not a talent. Yep.
Right. I wrote tons for a good 20 years. I was writing nonfiction, and I'm a good writer, meaning I can write serviceable prose with no problem. I also wrote for newspapers and things. I did some stringing and different things like that. So I'm a good writer, but switching to fiction was a little harder for me because it was just, I was too worried about perfection, I guess. It's a sort of a perfectionist type disease, and that's something that I've always struggled with. And so space opera kind of lets me get away from that. Whereas with the Newton stuff, I was very concerned to get the details right. And that kind of carried over into the present day stuff because she's traveling around London and Cambridge. So I know all the details, but I would always look things up, make sure I got something right. Like I got something really wrong in the beginning of the Newton cipher. Okay. In that first chapter, Newton or these sort of bad guys sail away along the River Cam, on a punt, right? Those boats that you push along with a pole because the River Cam is very shallow and you see people punting. Maybe you've seen pictures, Oxford and Cambridge, it's punting, right? If you're not careful, you'll wobble and fall in. So I say they go under this Bridge of Sighs, which is at next door St. John's College, right? It's this really cool bridge that you can see pictures of. And they sail kind of away into the night, leaving Newton kind of angry and scratching his head. Well, the Bridge of Sighs wasn't built till the 19th century. And I knew this. No. I knew this, but it was still in the 17th century in my book. And it was well after publication. I was reading it again. I opened it up for some reason. I read that and I'm like, oh, crap. And I looked it up real quick because I was sure. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that bridge didn't even exist. What do you do?
You're like,
right?
Dang it.
So that killed me for like 5 minutes. I was just like, oh, man.
That's because you're thinking of those 3 people who are going to notice.
Right. And then I'm like, no one's ever said anything. It's fiction. Yeah. Maybe in this world, the Bridge of Sighs was built 150 years early, St. John's College, by the way, where the Bridge of Sighs is, St. John's, which is next to Trinity, where Newton was. St. John's, well, has many famous people, but that's where Douglas Adams was. It's
really.
And another, since we're all science fiction geeks, I was in Cambridge in 2001. And I was walking by St. John's College the morning when I saw the newspaper that said Douglas Adams had just passed away in California. And I was like, I mean, it was fitting. It was sad, but I was like right there standing outside of St. John's where he was. And there was like a little newspaper because back then the internet, we didn't have phones and stuff, 2001. So I get newspapers sometimes just because that's what you did. It was very British,
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, just a small anecdote.
Huh. Interesting. The lives we've led. Let's see. We have a question from John Patterson. He wants to know, he's curious, what is your favorite scientific controversy in history?
My
gosh, there's so many.
There are. I think John would probably say something about dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs, yeah.
But for me, I don't know. Isaac Newton was great with controversy. He and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz sort of invented calculus at the same time. And Leibniz in Germany, they had sort of a different take on, but they basically came up with calculus at the same time. And Leibniz was a little more calm about it. I think he was a little more willing to share, to sort of share the credit in a way. Newton just wasn't having any of it. So I guess controversies are always fun when one or both sides are going at it, with tooth and nail, and Newton just couldn't handle. I'm oversimplifying a lot of things, but Newton didn't take things like that well. So those are fun just because you see how scientists are very human too, and can even be quite petty. So that controversy. Especially Newton, yeah, and that wasn't the only time he went at it with folks. So so that's always a good one. The sort of debate over the priority of who discovered calculus. Newton just did not give ground at all. So
yeah, see, that's one of the things that throws me off when someone writes Isaac Newton as a good guy, right? I'm like, no, like I get lost right away. I'm like, no.
I mean, he wasn't a bad guy. He was, I think he was just very insecure, especially.
Yeah, but he wasn't nice.
He wasn't nice. No, he could be really, really nasty.
And very intolerable. So yeah, no way.
I mean, the story, there's this great quote, which sounds so noble, where he says, if I've seen farther than others, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. Well, one of the interpretations of that, he was writing that to kind of people at the Royal Society, and in particular talking about, Robert Hooke, because there was a controversy. Now, Robert Hooke, great microscopist, right? He did work with microscopes. Had this book called Micrographia. So, but Robert Hooke was a poor guy, meaning he didn't come from he didn't have a lot of money. He wasn't a well-to-do family like many of the Royal Society members. So Robert Hooke, well, he was a genius in his own right. As this is the era of Newton, but also Edmund Halley, Robert Hooke, Christopher Wren, who designed, the St. Paul's Cathedral and rebuilt much of London after the fire. So these were all contemporaries. Well, Robert Hooke smart as he was, didn't have a lot of money. So he worked as kind of an employee at the Royal Society, helping to run experiments and doing other things. But he was a runt. He was a hunchback. He was very small, pretty weaselly looking. Well, that sounds bad, but I mean, he was not an attractive man. He was pretty small, right? So when Newton, and so there was a controversy about some discoveries, which we don't need to go into, but it was between Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke. And so when Newton says, if I've seen farther than others, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. His subtext was, and it wasn't you, you little runt, you little puny little Robert Hooke. That's basically how some people interpret what he was saying, because it was kind of a backhanded, it wasn't just fronthand. He was basically saying, it wasn't you. I didn't learn this from you. I did it on my own, So giants, and you're not a giant. So yeah, he could be nasty.
Oh, he was pretty nasty. I always think of, for me, it's always that Malcolm Reynolds quote where he's like, the way he figured every statue, every man who had a statue made out of him was some kind of son of a bitch or another. I'm like, that is the most accurate quote I've ever heard, because that's definitely true. And Isaac Newton qualifies there. He's not my favorite. Let's see. Wait, we had another question from the audience. We have a question from Dave. Dave wants to know, did you draw the mechs out or design them visually before writing about them?
A little bit. I mean, I had some rough sketches. I can't draw very well at all. So I had an idea, but really in my mind, I kind of was using what I just described to you earlier. I kind of was picturing something between what Ripley used in Aliens and what the guys used in the battle, well, and in their cargo lifting in Avatar, when they were those military guys using those mechs to kind of shunt cargo around. It was kind of somewhere in between there. But in my story, there's different classes of cargo of mechs, right? But they're all based on their tonnage, what they can move around, because these are just workers, right? These are blue collar workers. So yeah, but I had an idea for I have light, medium, and heavy mechs. And when they realize they need to use them to defend themselves and to go on the offensive at certain points, they start wielding armor on them, or welding armor plating on them, and attaching rifles and stuff. So they're kind of, they look more Frankenstein-y than anything smooth and cool like you might see in like BattleTech, for example, where those are clearly military mechs from design to build. So that's kind of the fun, because they're always like, damn, my arm just blew off, and they're, kind of winging it as they go. And through the book, they progress to more and more powerful equipment based on some of the encounters they have. But so yeah, I mean, I had an idea in my mind, but I didn't actually sketch them out, but I kind of knew what they were like. And they're described in the books, and that's kind of how I visualize them. So.
Very cool. Do you do a lot of podcasts or anything?
I mean, I do my share, but they are, not of my own. I don't do, but I go to a lot, and I tend to do a lot of history-based podcasts. I did a couple the past few years where I was supposed to do live presentations about Colorado or naturalists, right? Because I've written on history of science in Colorado in the 19th century, so I get requests now and then to do that. But the eclipse book that you mentioned, which is cycling through my America's First Great Eclipse, when that came out in the beginning of 2017, in those months building up to the great eclipse of in August, I did radio shows, I did TV shows, I did podcasts, I did all kinds of stuff, and so that was actually pretty exhausting. I was doing some that were like, I was up till 1 a.m. Maybe we would start at 1 a.m. They were these late night ones, but they were some pretty fun, big markets like New York and Chicago and stuff. But, but at those late ones, I got crazy questions sometimes of guys who were clearly people. It was always guys, males, who needed sleep, but they would ask like if the eclipse was hiding the government tracking device or something like this. And I'd be like, the host would save me, but we got a caller. Yeah. So do you think when the eclipse happens, it'll reveal will we get glimpses of the government, whatever satellites that are like radiating our brains? Or I'd be like, and the host would be like, all right, next caller. So anyway,
that's the best ever.
Oh yeah. It was fun. I usually had a beer with me for those calls, or two. My wife who couldn't sleep because I'd be doing it in our room because our daughters were smaller then. She'd bring me beer and stuff and just kind of laugh. So, but for the most part, that was really fun. So answering your question, I mean, I do. I'm not sure if you were going somewhere with that, but
yeah,
I
no.
do my
It was very simple. I was actually going to ask because Steve H&H says you have a really nice camera. He likes your camera. So I was wondering if you got specifically that camera for these kind of engagements.
The camera's just my iMac. I do use a Yeti mic, a blue Yeti or Yeti blue mic, but no, it's just my iMac camera. So
it just works well, I guess.
Yeah,
we have some podcaster friends. They're always looking at equipment.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Since we started talking about America's First Great Eclipse, and that is your nonfiction novel, and so I'm figuring that you must have done a ton of research for that. I was wondering, what was the coolest thing you learned besides, the radiating satellites?
Well, that was so I did. It's funny because that came out of an article I wrote in 2010. Right, I was just doing some other research on Colorado and came across some articles about this eclipse that occurred in 1878, right, which was a really big deal. So I wrote a short article and thought, because I knew we had this big total eclipse coming in 2017. You can predict those things, obviously, centuries, thousands of years in advance, really.
Yep.
So I knew it was coming, and I planned on writing it, expanding that article, because I got a lot of interest. And another guy wrote a book. He read my article apparently and some other stuff, but he read my article and wrote a book too. So there were actually two books about the 1878 eclipse out at the same time. I never actually read his. I just thought it would be easier not to kind of have his stuff in mind while I was doing all my talks and stuff. People were very interested in it, right? Because the 1878 eclipse, there were a lot of parallels to the 2017 one, and then the next one coming up in 2014, although that one's not going to go across the country like the 17 one did, from west to east coast. I mean, that was really cool.
Wait, you said 2014. So what?
I'm sorry,
what years?
2024.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, and it's going to come over Mexico, Texas, kind of across the Midwest and up into Canada. Yeah, it's going to be sweet. So you guys I'm going to come hang out with you.
We have a big old house. You're more than welcome.
So, but anyway,
we have beer too.
So I did do a lot of research, and I had kind of so my article that I wrote in 2010 was just an outline for this book that I wrote a few years later, or well, I was more, I wrote it kind of the year before the eclipse in 2017, and it's a short book. I mean, it's not more than 30,000 words. I wanted to write one of those airplane books, right, where you pick it up, you read it over 2 hours, and then you're done. So the chapters are short, but it's really fun. It's a nice, zippy, speedy read. The most interesting thing, I mean, Thomas Edison makes an appearance, and he's a character too. Talk about Isaac Newton. I mean, Edison, he had his own issues, but he was a lot of fun. But I think the neatest thing that I came across in that book, and it's a chapter where people were up on top of Pikes Peak, and I just found this report that's contemporary from 1878. It came out a few days after the eclipse. When someone, they hiked back down from the Pikes Peak, and one guy who was up there, very well educated, because you can tell the way he writes this, and it's anonymous, so I don't know who did it, but so I quote it at length, but it's basically this description of standing on top of Pikes Peak. Now, you've been to Colorado Springs. You can see Pikes Peak. Pikes Peak's a 14,000 foot peak. Colorado has 54, 55, depending on who you ask, 56, 14,000 foot peaks, but it doesn't get any higher. So when you're up on one, you see all the other peaks in the distance, and you see nothing else except what's below you. I mean, it's pretty magical.
That's so kind of cool.
This guy on Pikes Peak describes how the eclipse is just coming from the west, and you see these distant peaks, and it's like this wall of darkness, and you're up so high, there's nothing to impede this view for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And he talks about how, like, the peaks just get sort of they blink out one by one as the wall of darkness comes towards him. And then it just, you're engulfed, and then he was engulfed, and then it moves on again out across the plains, because Pikes Peak, of course, that's the end of the eastern edge of the Rockies, right? So because you've been there, and I think many people who are watching who live there or have seen it, then you're on the plains. So then you turn east, and the eclipse keeps going, and it just, and then of course off in the distance the peaks reappear, and then the wall of blackness moves out and we're talking 1,000 plus miles an hour too, out over the plain. So the way he describes it is just fantastic, and it was so good that instead of quoting like a couple sentences or even a paragraph, I think I quoted like 2 or 3 pages worth, because it's just one of the coolest descriptions of a total solar eclipse I've ever seen. And so that's in the book, and I think that's the thing that's the one like historical discovery that I think was the neatest part of that. So, but there was a lot of neat stuff from 1878. So.
Well, I like that. 30,000 words. I like my nonfiction short for some reason. Maybe
Yeah.
it was like you said, so many years in college with these big old books, you lose interest before you actually get to the good parts. I kind of like it when you just take one thing and talk about it in the nonfiction. So that's really good length.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like
I
that.
think so too.
That's pretty cool. You just convinced me to read it. Let's see. I want to see that. No, I can't. I keep wanting to do the 14Kers. I figure if we're gonna, I'll just take KJA's number. How's that? I think that's
Yeah.
legit.
Kevin leads hikes. So
Yeah, yeah. No, he would kill me. I can't even walk with him when we go to the lunch. He's too fast. Let's see. Part of the problem is Colorado. You don't have any oxygen there.
that's true. I mean, it really does help to kind of come and hang out, even
Mm-hmm.
in Colorado Springs, because my house is at 7,000 feet. I mean, that's higher than most of the nation, right? But that's kind of the standard, even where we stay for superstars at the Antlers Hotel. I mean, Colorado Springs, I think its official elevation at City Hall is like 6,038 feet. So we're even, I mean, Denver's the mile high city, but we're like 1,000 feet higher or more.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you got to acclimate. I mean, before you even want to go up the mountains.
Yeah, there was no time for that. And I was like, I can't breathe. I cannot breathe right now.
And you don't want to do it in February anyway. I mean, you could, but you run the risk of being freezing and cold and running into a snowstorm, and that wouldn't be fun.
And considering this is Houston and I put on a jacket and closed-toed shoes when it gets to 72 degrees, yeah, I would die.
And we don't
acclimated to Colorado.
We don't want to send you back to Kevin, all frozen. So
I don't know. I might talk less. He might like that. He might pay you. It could happen.
This is, you said this is recorded and it's on YouTube forever, right?
It is. We've been married a long time. It's all good. So if you were forced to live in one of your worlds by a particularly tricky genie, which one would you choose?
I like my sci-fi world. So there's the one of the things, in this little backwater solar system where most of the events take place, so far anyway. There's only one planet that's habitable, and it's actually very nice. And that's, of course, where all the wealthy little princelings live, because they've got the money from their imperial families off in the far part of the empire. And all the workers, it's very expanse-like. They're living in asteroids and moon bases and stuff or stations where they have recycled air and basically eating the food that's processed from algae and things like that. I mean, I don't go into that, but that's the idea. And so only the very wealthy and the political rulers, are living on this island called Aquitania, which is, it's a very water-based planet, but it's got some nice islands where they live. And so in the end, of course, they're going to be able to sort of take it back, or at least take, the normal, the blue collar, the spacers will be able to go and be planet side. But I don't know. I like that planet that I described. I was like, oh, this sounds kind of fun, and I mean, it's got some danger to it. I've got these gigantic, nasty whale type creatures with fangs and sort of claws that they encounter a little bit, but you just don't go swimming there, right? Don't take your yachts out there like the wealthy princes did and had them destroyed. So, but I like that island. So I would probably, I haven't created a lot of worlds, but I think that one sounds fun.
That sounds cool.
Yeah.
So have you watched any TV lately that you've really gotten into?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of The Expanse. I think I've said that already. We were kind of some other, folks that we were chatting about it, because one of them just finished season 5, and we were like, oh yeah, Amos is the best, But big fan of Umbrella Academy. I've watched those both seasons a couple times. Not as big of a fan as some of the more recent Marvel stuff, although Winter Soldier is my man. So I did like Falcon and Winter Soldier.
Oh yeah.
We haven't finished Loki yet. I understand it ends well, but there was a lot of head scratching for the early parts. So I'll probably finish that. We did like WandaVision. But I think, I've really I just go back to The Expanse a lot. Even when I'm editing my work, I'll just let it run, because I love, I just love that show. And I think Umbrella Academy was just, especially.
Oh, I loved Umbrella Academy.
I hated it at first, right? I was like, these are appalling people.
Well,
Who
yeah,
wants to
they're all
watch
bad
them? And so the first episode, I was like, eh. But then they got to it, and then they did the Tiffany song, and I was like, all right. They totally struck something primal in my 80s, reptilian brain, and I was like, all right, this is pretty cool.
I have to watch it now.
So then I rewatched it, and then it was kind of like The Expanse. The first few seasons of the first few episodes of season 1, they're pretty hard to follow, and it's more detective, right? It's more noir than than space opera. And I was like, eh. And it's hard to follow because there's all these pieces that don't come together till the end, right? But if you go through, you realize, holy cow, this is genius. And you go back and rewatch it just to get all the bits that you missed, and you see how they're weaving it together. Yep. So maybe that's what I like about Expanse and Umbrella Academy is, the way that it's chaotic and even kind of off-putting at first, and then it totally draws you in and makes just a heck of a lot of great sense. For those of us who write stories, you're thinking, wow, I could learn something here. So
right, you're like, clever. When I watch a show, and I'm like, oh, that was clever. I like that. Let's see. Maya is commenting on your whales with big, sharp, nasty teeth. I think we have a little Monty Python here.
Yes, they do, Maya. They do. So they're big enough to destroy a yacht because they, in a way, I think my island Aquitania, or my world Aquitania, is sort of Dune-like, because I don't want to give too much away, but there's something there that no one knew was there that's going to be pretty important. So it's kind of like Spice, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not necessarily the same. But it does have these giant creatures. And when I wrote them, after I wrote them, I was kind of thinking, these kind of remind me of the sandworms, because they're very territorial. They didn't like the fact that these sort of ostentatious, very wealthy princes would drive their yachts up to that part of it's kind of in the northern reaches where they live. And so this one of my princes who's a good guy in the end. I mean, he was a spacer who made good, unlike the rest of them who were sort of born into wealth and just sent out here because they were the sixth and seventh sons to this backwater system to do something for their family if they could. And it turns out it's going to be a pretty important system. But the one guy who's in the political game, who's a good guy, who's kind of a self-made spacer, right? So he plays an important role. But he got greedy too, and a bit arrogant, and took made money, had one of his pleasure yachts out, and almost died, and lost a lot of his people. And that kind of was a turning point for him when one of these big whale creatures, it was hubris, right? Greek concept of hubris. He thought he was the shit, if you'll excuse my French, and nature put him in his place. So it's like classic Greek tragedy, except they're not Greek, and it's not what the whole story is about. But.
And there aren't any gods.
Right.
Gods are the fun part. Let's see. So actually, we are almost at an hour. So I think
really?
We have one more question. We're going to do our lightning round. So last question is, what do you hope readers get from your work?
I think I don't have pretensions of anything other than enjoyment. I really hope that they enjoy it. With my sort of historical fantasy or fiction that I'm writing, maybe they'll learn something, because I do try to make it accurate. But that's more just for the enjoyment of it, too, because it's no fun if you know something about history, like, oh man, that ain't right, and that ain't even good right. It's one thing if you change something, or that ain't even good wrong. If you change something because it works for the plot, but if you just make a mistake, then that's kind of lame. So I try not to do that. But really, I just want people to enjoy writing. If they like science fiction, I hope they like my science fiction. If they like sort of thrillers, supernatural thrillers, I hope they like that stuff. So, yeah. Awesome.
So who has inspired you along the way?
Writers, you think, or are you talking about, or just anyone?
It could be anyone. Mm-hmm.
Well, I suppose certainly have to say my wife, who is very tolerant of the stuff that I do and lets me, sort of indulge in these worlds. So she's great. I'm a big fan, though, on the writer side of Neil Stephenson. He's probably my favorite author. It takes you years to get through his books. Mm-hmm. And then they're great weapons, against burglars or elephants. But,
or teeth whales.
Talk about someone who puts in historical detail. The Baroque cycle just blew me away. But all of his stuff is he makes detail fun and interesting, and still has great action and stuff. So I've just always sort of been in awe of someone like him. But there's lots of people, from Kevin Anderson to David Brin to Eric Flint, who have inspired me. So you know the usual suspects, Kelly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's lots of them out there. Writers are awesome. What hobbies do you enjoy to refill your creative cup?
I like to do obstacle course racing. You kind of mentioned that you could see some of my medals behind here earlier. I do Spartan races, especially a little bit of Tough Mudder, but I love Spartan races because they give me a goal. So when I work out, when I run and lift and climb and stuff like that, I'm kind of working towards something. As I'm getting older, I want to make sure that I stay in shape. And so it's kind of fun because Spartan races give you an age group category. And I've been somewhat competitive. I've never been on the podium, but I've been in the, top 15, close to top 10 sometimes. That makes me happy. It's just fun to see how far I can push myself. Plus, it's fun to get muddy. And at Spartan races, you get to throw a spear, and that's just cool.
Ooh.
That's just cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But if you miss the target, you have to do burpees, 30 of them. So
what? It's not so fun anymore. Let's see. What's your favorite flavor of ice cream?
I like vanilla, not because it's vanilla, but because it's got so much potential. You can put peanut butter on it. You can throw chocolate chips on it. You can make it chocolate if you want. Strawberries. So that's kind of what I like.
Gotcha. You like the creative aspect.
Yeah.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee. Come on.
I have to ask. You never know.
I have an expensive Italian espresso machine and an expensive Italian grinder. When I lived in Europe, we go to Italy. You go and get espresso in Rome. You cannot go back. I'm sorry. My wife won't even leave the house until I've made her a latte anymore. So
see, you spoiled her too.
Yeah.
Hot or cold weather?
Cold.
Cold. Favorite style of music?
Probably rock.
Love
Classic rock.
Excellent. My son and you would get along. He just listened to the entire Dark Side of the Moon. He's like, Mom, this album's awesome. It's so cute when they discover things.
How old is he?
He's 20 now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, he's been into David Bowie lately. So now he's going on to Floyd.
Awesome.
In his head, they're connected. Anyways, so finally, where can fans find you and your work?
So I just, I don't use a lot of Facebook, but I do have a Facebook page. I think you're going to put it up, right? But it's just facebook.com. Steve Ruskin author, I think. At my website is steveruskin.com, steveruskin.com. And you can go there. You can get a free copy of The Devil's Broker novella, and that'll sign you up for my newsletter. I don't spam. I do it once a month on average. And then you can find out more about some books. And I should say that I've got a cool project that I'll probably be announcing in the next newsletter. I'm co-writing a series that I was asked to write with a pretty well-known science fiction author, which still kind of blows me away that I was asked to help doing that. So
exciting. I look forward to it. So excellent. So now that Steve Ruskin is your current favorite writer, please make sure to review his work and also review us wherever it is you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitch and subscribe on YouTube at curseddragonship.com/YouTube. So can't wait to see you. Next week we have Stevie Causey on, so we can ask them all the awesome questions. And we want to thank our subscribers. We have Jenny, Dave, D.H. Dunn, Helen Savor, and Mari Dietz. Thank you so much for subscribing and helping us keep these lights on. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.